I'd like to welcome you wholeheartedly. We wanted to invite you to participate in a discussion today, a discussion on a topic that some of our guests have deemed quite obvious and interesting. Others have thought it to be extremely controversial. Poland, Hungary, Russia, a common denominator with a question mark. This is not a thesis, this is a question. A question about systemic changes that take place in different time periods, because it's a completely different time perspective in Russia, completely different in Hungary. In Poland, if we can be talking about systemic changes, systemic transformations, so changes aimed at changing the system, for the last 2 years, so it's a completely different time perspective. I do realize there are tremendous differences between our countries, differences both at the fundamental level. In Russia, there has never been any democracy, and democracy, in my own opinion, although it's still questionable, still exists in Poland. It has existed in Hungary. It has never existed in Russia. So these are fundamental differences, but there are also many more detailed ones. Despite all those differences, we thought it interesting, important, and justified to inquire about similarities, whether they exist, if they do, what areas they occupy, and how we perceive them, how we perceive it from the Hungarian perspective, from the Russian perspective, and how we perceive it from the Polish perspective, of course. Today we are hosting 3 wonderful speakers. Tatiana Vorozheikina, a political scientist, an expert responsible for Russia, but for a long time she has been responsible for Latin America, and now she's a lecturer in the Economic and Political Science University in Moscow. Maciej Gdula, a sociologist, publicist, member of the editorial staff of Krytyka Polityczna, from the Institute of Sociology of the Warsaw University. It's quite dear to my heart because I have graduated from the same place as well. He has published a lot, Lifestyle and Class Order in Poland, published 5 years ago. Right now he's working upon yet another publication to discuss changes or transformations in Poland. So this is a clear summary. Bálint, Magyar, historian, a politician, a minister of education twice, in Hungary, of course, the Secretary of State responsible for developmental policy in Hungary. Today, he's a member of the board of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and the author of a book that some of you know, a post-communist mafia state, the case of Hungary, published last year. I would like to ask each and every one of you to speak for about 12 minutes at the beginning, and then we will have a discussion with the participants. I would like to suggest to start with the external perspective and to end with the Polish one. Perhaps we should start from the east, so Russia. Then let's go a bit to the south. And then finally return to Poland. Tatiana, over to you. Thank you very much. I'm deeply moved that I can speak in this room again. Now, about the common denominator, I'm responsible for Russian issues, or at least for discussing them. I'm not really sure whether we can be talking about any common denominator, but let me tell you a few words about Russia in the short time that I have at my disposal. And yet another thing, today is the 7th of November 2017, so the 100th years anniversary of the October Revolution. Of course, this relates to the authoritarian regime in Russia, and something that is especially sad from my point of view, namely the problems that Russia was facing at the beginning of the 20th century. The authoritarian regime that lost touch with the society to an increasing extent, and second of all, an extreme weakness of public and state institutions. Third thing, referring to the words of the sociologist Yuria Levata from Russia, is the axis of social institutions that social and political conflicts focus upon. These issues define the agenda of the public discussions in our times, but also 100 years ago or at the beginning of the 20th century. So both now and 100 years back, a huge country exploded in 1917, and it seems it's under perfect control nowadays. Of course, I can't refrain to mention an article about Putin and the revolution in The Economist Weekly, where a thesis is presented that the longer Putin is in power, the bigger chaos there be when he actually leaves. Let me start with mentioning the book by Bálint, Magyar, about the anatomy of that mafia state. That book was published in Russia. Hungary was in the title, for anybody not to think anything wrong. I generally agree with similar theses, and I like to reflect upon some important elements in the Russian context. Bálint Magyar says that in the case of Hungary and Russia, not only Russia as a matter of fact, but many post-Soviet regimes, we are dealing not only with the revival or recreation of a certain model, but we're dealing with a birth of something that the author calls the post-communist mafia state, post-communist product of a certain collapse, and a mafia product because it is a well-developed structure of a parasite state that is based on a family clan and that makes use of public funds. The thesis concerns Hungary, but in the Russian context, I'd like to ask a question whether we are dealing with the state. In the case of Putin's Russia and Orban's Hungary, are we dealing with the state or a system of public institutions, or is it a system of public authority that Kelly Rodu, an American sociologist of Argentinian origin, simply calls naked power without any institutionalization? I think that, to tell you the truth, in Russia we are dealing with the private nature of the state and the weakness of institutions when we're talking about the public institutions. No matter whether we are dealing with a democratic or authoritarian regime. For example, in Latin America and Brazil and Chile, we had to deal with an institutionalized authoritarian regime. In Russia, on the other hand, if we're dealing with change in the rules of the game. We have state structures, but only by the name. If we look at the era of Nicholas I and the last quarter of the 19th century, and also in the times of Brezhnev, they are the elements that express private interests of groups that are actually in power at the moment. So this is the private nature of the Russian state, which has been brought to the extreme during the Putin era. I think that the state does not exist as a system of public institutions in Russia. Every institution is supported at all various levels by the interests of officials or specific other people who run those institutions, such as governors, mayors, or oligarchs. And of course, the rules of the game are not the same for everyone. That is why I agree with what Bálint Magyar says, namely that state authority and state-owned enterprises are ambiguous concepts. For example, Rosneft seems to be a state-owned enterprise, but it is managed by a private individual and it serves private interests. I'm not even talking about other companies that are state-owned, but either directly through relatives, they have ties with the head of the state. So my first thesis is that authority does not equal state. And that is why a mafia state is an oxymoron. We should be talking about a mafia regime. Yet another thesis that concerns Russia, and here I think this is something that we heard during previous discussions. Very often, international authority does not want to call the regime authoritarian. Sometimes we're talking about a hybrid regime, etc. Various notions are applied. I'm not going to dwell upon this any longer, but the Russian regime does match the definition of authoritarianism that was presented in the classical work about totalitarian regimes. It's got such elements as a certain restriction of political pluralism that legitimizes the regime, and second of all, we have to do with a political demobilization of citizens that are sometimes replaced by a manipulation of the society with the regime. So we see that in recent times, after the annexation of Crimea and after the war in Crimea broke out. The regime was started to base its activities on this new mobilization. I think that among Russian political scientists, it is quite common to speak about a hybrid regime. Mr. Levinsky and other authors have introduced that notion. However, they meant a completely different thing. They were not referring to Russia at all. They wanted to depart from a certain perception of Russia as an imperfect democracy, however, still a democracy. It was a competitor authoritarianism, which was contrasted with the notion of a non-liberal democracy introduced by Zakayev. I think that the Russian regime can be described quite well with that classical notion of authoritarianism. And despite the fact that there are regular elections held there, the situation has not changed at all. Taking the example of Latin America, I know that even the worst dictatorships did hold regular elections in Honduras, Salvador, or Guatemala, but it didn't have anything to do with the real power, because the real authority was placed in the hands it was supposed to, that is among the military men and oligarchs. Another typical feature is the unity of power and ownership. It seems to me that with small exceptions, the most effective way to have access to property was the so-called public institutions. The Putin's regime has brought this to an extreme. That is why it's much closer to traditional authoritarian dictatorships of Latin America, like in Nicaragua or the Republic of Dominicana. I'm mentioning that quite consciously because those regimes would focus their economic assets and economic property, and that's how they ruled the country. And here I'm referring to what Mr. Magyar wrote about Hungary. How were such regimes created? How did it all come about? Mafia regimes that are based upon the unity of authority and ownership, or the control of authority over ownership, like in Russia or Hungary, came about in various ways. But in many cases, they had a democratic foundation, or at least one that was deemed to be democratic. In Hungary, political business got subordinated to the political party Fidesz, and on the other hand, in Russia, the situation was slightly different. The metamorphosis of the regime took place as early as the 90s. In 1991 and 1993, a substantial step was taken when steps were taken in order to appropriate people who were to privatize property that among people who was close to those in power. It was not a bottom-up privatization that could support SMEs. This is what happened in Poland, among others. Political choices were made at that time, namely, the political sphere was considered to be a management and not a participation zone. At the beginning of the 90s, the economic system was reduced to a market system. They thought that democracy could only thrive in market conditions. Therefore, no democratic institutions that would help citizens defend their interests were established through effective democratic channels. That is why, in the 90s, in Russia, people gave up democratic institutions so easily because they were institutions that got compromised and were used as a tool in the struggle for power at the beginning of the 90s. In Russian towns at that time, liberal values such as tolerance, the freedom of speech, and the division of powers, those values had a very important place in Russia in the surveys. So one cannot say that the Russians were not ready for democracy. They were, but they did not receive any democratic tools. Now, yet another thing I'd like to mention, since my time is quickly running out, let me point out the following thing. During the Yeltsin's reign, that is in the 90s, the bases for such a regime were established, the regime of unity of authority and ownership. So we did not succeed either at the democracy or at the market, because for the market to function effectively, we should have guarantees for private ownership, independent judiciary, etc., etc. And all of that was gotten rid of during the Putin era. As I understand, there is a certain parallel with the events in Hungary, but that was used as the support and foundation for power in the 90s. in contrast to the oligarchs. And later, when Putin was indicated as the successor, repressive structures emerged. Oligarchs started to get appointed for various roles. Now about Poland and Hungary. And here I'm mainly basing myself on Mr. Magyar's book. Hungary is an example where the mafia regime can appear also while there is multi-partisan democracy in the country and while there are democratic transfers of power. As says Mr. Magyar, in Hungary we were truly observing a Western type of democracy. There were democratic institutions. However, in Russia, in the 90s, those institutions were much weaker. And there was no democratic transfer of power in Russia on any occasion, but it did happen in Hungary. So when we take a look at certain fragility of democratic structures, especially in Hungary, Hungary is the worse, more depressive case, because Russia has got imperial history and some resentiments regarding the empire. So, well, Hungary needed to leave behind the Habsburg monarchy and the modernization that happened in the 19th century. Despite that, you can draw the conclusion that even quite well-developed democratic institutions do not protect the state against authoritarianism if one political power can gain monopoly and on that basis do away with democratic institutions. If the decisive factor in such authoritarian regime is the monopoly of power, unfortunately, I need to admit it, sadly, starting from October 2015, Poland is also on that path. I said it today, and I will repeat it once again. In my opinion, the fact that law and justice are gaining more and more partisans comparing to October 2015. Well, a week ago I was in Poznan and I saw on the TV that PiS had 47% of support in the surveys, whereas other parties are losing support and are slowly vanishing into oblivion. PiS has got the possibility to do what happened in Hungary or, God forbid, in Russia. But there is an important difference, that is the economic basis of those regimes. Poland is different from Hungary and Russia, and that depended on the development of Polish capitalism after systemic transformations in 1989. Anyway, I think that, well, denying the fact that the Polish authorities can go that way would be quite imprudent, of course. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong. At the beginning of 2016, I read an article in a newspaper, an article quoting Jarosław Kaczyński. So he said those words even 2 years before the elections. He said that he wanted Warsaw to become a new Budapest. And here he meant a certain national consolidation, the consolidation of a nation state that would defend itself against European authorities. So there is a certain ideological proximity, despite all the differences that we will be talking about today. I need to reaffirm it. To end, let me briefly discuss the common denominator. I think it is both political and institutional. A common denominator in those situations is the growing or existing monopoly of a party for political power and the weakening and destruction of democratic institutions, the lack of division of powers, and depriving the judiciary of its independence. How could we counteract this? I think three things need to be said, or three trends need to be outlined. A few days after Donald Trump won the elections, one of the political scientists said that the American institutions proved unable to make it possible for an authoritarian leader to occupy the highest position in the country. I think in the citizens, in the civic society, there might be forces that will be able to neutralize such authoritarian policy. I don't know how it happens in Poland, but in Russia I've been worrying about that for many years. The opposition do not have their own language, they do not have their own political agenda. The opposition basically discusses the things that the authoritarian regime throws at them. So this is what we say in Russia, what Putin thinks, what he wants, what he doesn't want, and we are not dealing with the processes taking part in the society. For example, if we think about free media, such as Echo Moskwy, such topics are discussed there. So all those regimes, both Putin's and Orban's and Kaczynski's, and the current authorities in Poland, all those regimes turned able to present their ideology as the defense of morality against the rotten West. Of course, I'm not going to discuss that thesis, but let me tell you that on the 26th of March, and also in October and July this year, I took part in street demonstrations. I see that people go out into the streets in order to defend some moral values. So in order to have a voice against corruption and lies. This is how we can counteract those regimes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Out of the several parallels indicated at the end of the presentation, the most striking one are two: anti-Western character of governments. Hard to imagine that Poland would be close to Russia on that front. And the lack of common language of the opposition. It's the constant anti-Putinism in Russia and anti-Kaczynskism in Poland. Now, let's hear from Hungary on that score.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak to you. I would like very briefly compare the two autocratic attempts, the Hungarian one and the Polish one. In spite of the similarities of some ideological panels, the two autocratic attempts is very much different from each other. What are those panels which both regimes use? One for legitimizing their authority over the society. One is that they are speaking both about the betrayal of the regime change of the 1980s, at the turn of 1980s, 1990s. They say that it was just a deal of elites above the head of the people. This serves to discredit that liberal democratic period of both countries, both Poland and Hungary, and their election victory is presented as a new regime change, not just change in government, not just change in governance, but a new regime change. This they describe as a kind of revolution. Even in Hungary, they say that it's a revolution of the ballot boxes, where the people voted for the revolution to abolish the whole regime, what was before, and now to create a genuine new regime, a regime change. Such a way, when they define the nation, it's not a unification of all citizens. They do not understand it, that they unite the citizens of the country and they belong to the nation, but it's their normal terminology, what they use to exclude that part from the nation who is critical towards them. So, contrary to the classic nationalism of the 19th century, where the nationalism practically unites even the ethnic citizens of a country and converts it into a modern citizenship as a nation, and is directed against other nations. The nationalism of the Orbán regime is not directed against other nations, is directed against his own nation, against those who who are not loyal to this new regime, to this new government. So it's also a difference. The next similarity between the two countries. The next ideological panel is their Euroscepticism, when they declare that, of course, they would like to belong to Europe and the European Union, but at the same time, this Europe should be the Europe of nations. This, to be a Europe of nations is just a declaration when they say that European Union has obligations towards them, mainly funding some investments in these countries, but on the other hand, they would retain their autonomy. Under their autonomy, they understand, both regimes understand that these countries should not be cope with the norms of liberal democracies. If they, let us say, do not respect the separation of branches of power, then the European Union should not intervene in it. And even if they steal the European funds, then there should not be any European authority against it. It's not an accident that both Poland and Hungary oppose the authority of the European level Chief Attorney's Office, which should start procedures in the case of misuse of European funds. And at the end, also as a common ideological element, their campaign against refugees, which of course is based partly on a general view of the population, but these, what I call not hate campaigns, but fear campaigns, because the real nature of a real aim of this campaign, not to create hate against the refugees, but to create fear in the population against refugees, to have a target group which should serve as a scapegoat for a lot of emotions, and creating fears just to demonstrate that just the strong state, the strong regime, what we are, can defend you from refugees and can ensure that you can save your cultures. But in spite of the fact that these ideological panels are very similar, at the same time they are absolutely different types of autocratic attempts. The first difference in conditions that in 2010, with seizing the 53% of the votes on the election, the Fidesz gained 67% of the seats in the parliament. Next election, already manipulating the election law, 44% was enough for them to have two-thirds majority in the parliament. It means that the Fidesz got an unlimited political power. Unlimited political power means that one single political force can rewrite the constitution, rewrite all laws without any consensus with any other political force or any part of the society, civil society, NGOs, or other opposition political parties. And at the same time, they can alone decide to appoint their cadres at the top of its institutions, which could serve as the institutions of checks and balances. It's not the case in Poland, because they do not have such a constitutional majority. This regime tries to use other tricks somehow to change such conditions which could not be changed without the permission of the constitution. But now if we make a difference between the two regimes, just my statement, because it's very difficult in such a short time to argue about it, that the Polish attempt is just an attempt, a classic autocratic attempt to build an authoritarian state, and they are on the way of it, and the Polish, this transformation from a liberal democracy into an authoritarian regime is still far from the point of no return. So Poland is in a much better position for somehow to hamper to have this development accomplished. While in Hungary, they built a mafia state. I will speak about what does it mean, and we are around the point of no return when what we could see, let us say, in a lot of cases in Russia, some Central Asian countries, and even in some cases in Ukraine or Moldova, when through formal elections they could not change the regime. There were popular upheavals which swept away these ruling elites. But if I put relatively simplified, if I list in a very simplified dichotomies the differences between the two regimes, I would say that the Polish regime is motivated by concentration of political power and ideological indoctrination. The Orbán regime, concentration of political power and accumulating personal family wealth. The Polish one is much more an ideology-driven regime, while the Hungarian one is an ideology-applying regime. It's a different thing. Kaczynski, to some aspect, is much more, could be considered as fanatic and emotional. Orbán is cynic and rational, non-emotional. These are huge differences. But let's go to structural differences, because by profession I'm a sociologist, and my identity is identity of a sociologist. So my basic question is that who is the actor? Who is the player? And then in a post-communist mafia state, you can see that those terms that the ruling party decided about this or that, the government decided about this or that, or the parliament decided about this or that, it has no sense at all. These organizations, these institutions do not decide about anything. The decision-making in a post-communist mafia state is taken out from the formal institutions and to put into some informal bodies, and these informal bodies consist of persons with formal positions in the executive power and other places in the political life, and persons who has no formal power or formal position at all. But they belong to this small circle of people who bring really decisions. While, I'm speaking now about mafia states and in Hungary, about Hungary, the formal institutions are just transmission belts of the decisions of this decision-making small circle. For example, in the Fidesz, the elected vice president of the Fidesz, they are practically Niemans, nobodies. They do not have any real political power. They are just puppets. And those who has some other type of powers, they are not within the formal leadership of the Fidesz. This is when I mean, even symbolically, there is not any such event when they say that the Presidium of the Fidesz or the National Council of the Fidesz launched a program, decided about this or that. It does not happen. Contrary to this, in the case of Poland, still those who has real power, they are still within the PiS, within this formal organization. It's a centralized party, while the Fidesz in Hungary, this right-wing party, is a transmission belt party. In Hungary, the structure of the nature of the ruling elite is what, as I call it, as a clan structure. It's an adopted political family, which means that there is the structure of the ruling elite follows the anthropological structure of an extended patriarchal family, where the chief patron disposes and not governs without any restrictions, and those who are joining to this, who are adopted to this so-called clan or adopted political family, they will be a part of a patron-client system. And this patron-client, or what's happening in the society, is a transformation of the abolishment of autonomous positions, institutional and individual positions, and developing different type of patron-client vassalage relations. As I guess in the Polish case, it's much more a state dirigists control, where they enlarge the share of the influence of the state, but these things remain within formal organizations. And there is a huge difference concerning their relation to the economy and the private free market, private enterprises. Here still, I haven't heard about that with state coercion they would expropriate the enterprises or ownership of private entrepreneurs and redistribute it within their new ruling elite. But this is the case in Hungary. It happens all the time, practically every day. With state coercion, with the help of legislation on one hand, with the help of the state chief attorney's office, with the help of tax authorities, etc., they blackmail, and state coercion happens. They take away properties of entrepreneurs and rechannel it to new within their realm. So this is why I say that this attempt, for building an autocratic regime, is much more, I would say, a classic authoritarian regime, goes into that direction. It's not accomplished. While in the case of Hungary, it's much more already an accomplished process where such a situation emerged. What we can witness, what I say in Tatiana said also in Russia or Central Asian countries, where power and property, power and ownership cannot be separated from each other. This is why, for example, when Tatiana was speaking about the importance of the language, normally academics are just discussing, just discussing about the general naming of the regimes, and this is why they call illiberal democracy or liberal autocracy and all these things, hybrid regimes, etc. But at the same time, which is a contradiction, they use the complete terminology for the description of these post-communist autocratic regimes, the terminology what they use for the description of the liberal democracies. But those terms, what are used for that, politics, politicians, entrepreneurs, etc., political parties, etc., they could not be used for the description of these regimes. These regimes are not in transition from dictatorship to democracy. These regimes are genuine regimes, I mean these autocratic regimes with their own rules, and which it would be just needed to understand their genuine nature and character. Thank you very much.
It's not easy to bring Poland and Hungary to one common denominator. Maybe that's not bad news. It's not bad news that Poland has not managed to build the second Budapest. Is that right, or do you beg to differ, Doctor? Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this debate. I am happy to share my thoughts about similarities between Russia, Hungary, and Poland. May I perhaps start by suggesting a framework within which we can reflect upon the changes in the countries? I suppose we tend to look at the developments from the point of view of the end state. Something is coming to an end. Liberal democracy is coming to an end. The world order is coming to an end. And, you know, this is why we are reverting from liberal democracy. I suppose there are three ends people talk about most often. First, the end of neoliberal capitalism. And I I will concentrate why anti-liberal sentiments crop up and why such regimes come to surface, authoritarian regimes. First, the first reason of the end of neoliberal capitalism, it has been revealed that capitalism creates an enormous tension, an enormous a gap that democracies cannot cope with. This is why new political entities come into being, and they sort of manage and use all those gaps and all those tensions. Secondly, and this is related to the end of the consensual public sphere, the sort of public sphere which is dominated by hard principles of discussions, but the aim is to come to an agreement. And critics of liberal democracies say that these types of discourses excluded certain type of voices. There was no space for experiencing suffering, unemployment, or resentment towards the others. All these resentments, all these concerns and issues were actually collected by those who were anti-liberal. Thirdly, there is apparently an end of the European Union as an idea, as a utopia. Well, there's an ever enlarging Europe, open to more countries than actually are now in the membership. And obviously, the Europe is all about stability of development. This seems to be coming to an end. This is why liberal democracies leave and set on a journey towards conservative regimes. There is some truth to it, what I said, but it certainly doesn't bring us closer to finding an alternative or finding a solution. I suppose portraying reality from the point of view of the end of things is kind of a nostalgic love affair, if you like, but it doesn't bring you the practical solutions. And if you sentimentalize the end, you seem to miss the reality and the practicalities of the current situation. So, what new things do I see? What is it that I believe is much more powerful as a fuel for authoritarian regimes? First, the tensions within neoliberalism. The past 10 years, the last decade, has been an era of excellent growth in Poland, not just on paper. Real salaries, real wages have grown by 50%. Wages haven't stagnated as in the West. It hasn't been a mediocre growth. It has been a 50% growth. The income gap has been squeezed. Unemployment have been reduced. Jan Strzelecki is not sure that we have reduced the income gap, but we have. It was 36 points in the Gini scale in 2010, and it was 30 in 2015. I'm talking about a tendency. Obviously, we can debate whether the measurement is correct, and whether inequalities aren't perhaps bigger than the tests would suggest. But anyway, the trend is clear. Unemployment has been reduced massively from 20 to 7%, and it's totally different to what we see in Greece or the United States. But nonetheless, we have a neo-authoritarian regime. If we don't take it into consideration, we are self-blinding ourselves. It's not just capitalism that is to blame. If it was the case, Platforma Obywatelska, or the Civic Platform, should have won the third time, but It did not win, and it did not win for a reason, because other tensions had accumulated, non-economic tensions. They are symbolic and class-related. Class is not just about money or assets. Class is also about culture. So the class-related source of support for authoritarian power is not poverty, is not uncertainty or precarity. It's because people have more and more aspirations, and they are being told that everyone should be part of the middle class. Plus, specifically for Poland, the narrative in Poland is there are no elites. There are no elites. This is the sociological mantra in Poland, and elites buy that, and they buy that personally. When I did research on theatre, elites defended entertainment theatre. It's great entertainment. People will have fun.
When it turns out that there are elites, in fact, and they live a completely different life than middle class, I mean, they have no mortgage, they buy apartments for cash for their children, they send their children to study abroad, and they are not so much related to the nation state, and this does result in reluctance both by middle class and the lower class. That the lower class, because they just learn that elites are very wealthy and not related to them in any way, and the middle class because they get irritated because they it turns out that the game they played is not a game for everyone. I mean, there are people who are extremely privileged, and Law and Justice are using that. They're not saying there are different classes. They are offering people a new utopia. This is the utopia of Polishness. Everyone forms part of the national community. This is the source of peace support. Peace is very anti-elite, and at the same time they are very inclusive in terms of the lowest classes. They offer a space for them and also a kind of economic support. I'm thinking about 500 plus or increasing the minimum wage. However, we have not answered ourselves the question, what happens in the context of transformations in the public sphere? I think this is one of the key issues very often neglected when we are thinking about the social sources of support for peace. I think a lot has changed in the dynamics of politics and the way politics is organized. This is something related to the end of the old public sphere and an extreme growth in the role of political leaders. The political leaders have grown, social movements have grown, and the go-betweens and symbolic elites have lost. Why has that come about? Mainly due to internet. Today, everything is internet. Today, everything, like TV is internet, the press is internet, and the internet is internet as well. In this situation, political leaders have gained tremendous power. It is on them that the dispersed focus is sometimes placed. Jarosław Kaczyński did not win because he promised to organize a completely new political order. He won because, other people promised instead of him, like Duda and Szydło. They said they were going to be a better civic platform. This was the message for the elections in Poland. The political transformation has not come about through promising a radical change. A radical change was not anything on the agenda. Peace would have lost if they had suggested it, but later they were able to implement changes because Jarosław Kaczyński is an extremely strong leader who gives something to people. How much time do I have? 2 more minutes, right? 2.5. I have just finished research with my team in a small town in Mazovia, and what has shocked me is the fact that everything I knew about the sources of support for populism is not true. Briefly speaking, It's not true that people vote for populists because they express their experiences. No, people vote for populists because it's a wonderful social drama that unrolls before your eyes, and they offer tremendous gratification to you. Their personal experiences are marginalized in the name of politics. Today, this is much more important. One of the teachers from middle class, the support for peace in middle class is very high. One of the teachers used to tell us how she used to teach in middle school. Of course, they were wonderful children. There are some who were bad guys, but she loved to teach in middle schools. Now, peace is getting rid of middle schools. What does she say? She says it's good that they are demolishing middle schools. It's good that they are demolishing the judiciary and the banks. They should demolish everything because it's just one huge clique. So she is participating in social drama where what Jarosław Kaczyński is doing has deep sense. Even her personal experience does not prevent her from participating. Let's forget about populism. It doesn't work that way. Now, the question is, how does peace manage to link together the lower class and the middle class? They are both provided with pride and power, and we often forget about that while analyzing authoritarian regimes. We think it's just superficial or it's restricted to elites. But when I looked at that little town, people had a sense of power. Kaczyński gives them a sense of power vis-a-vis who? Vis-a-vis the weak and the elites. So the anti-refugee rhetoric is a sense of power. We can tell somebody we won't let them in. But what really amazed me also, according to the socially deprived, among workers, they say that 500 plus should not be received by those who drink alcohol and don't work, by the socially deprived. Also, I think that the sense of power vis-a-vis women is also happening. Although most people don't support the restriction of the anti-abortion law, the language that would provide for such a possibility is present there. So one could simply order women to give birth, and it will be a source of gratification. I think if we're looking for an alternative to peace and other authoritarian regimes, it cannot happen only with the participation of the civic society. There must be a new leader who will oppose Kaczyński. We complain that the opposition does not have their own language. I don't think it's a problem at all. Today, the language doesn't count at all. People count, action counts, events, and embodied role models. So opposition is not weak because they don't have their language, a language of their own. Jarosław Kaczyński does not have a language of his own. He's not saying that he's going to transform Poland into an authoritarian regime. Jarosław Kaczyński acts. He does away with collusions. He organizes agros. I'm not sure if that ideology is something that reflects the process that we're living quite well. Another thing, I think it's important to defend the cases that have been lost. All the cases that have been put aside today and are thought totally lost can become a support for an alternative to Kaczyński. What I'm thinking about refugees. Although 80% of people are against them, it's something that the opposition should be fighting for. It's also issues related to reproductive rights and gender issues in general. It's also the EU and an attempt to redefine the project. And the issue number 3 and 4 is pluralism. So a notion that is used up and unattractive slightly, but this is something worth talking about, mainly because this is something that might give you food for thought even to those who support peace today. Do they see a place for them in a system where peace would lose power? I think they don't, and I think that pluralism can be attractive not only for the opponents of peace, but also for their partisans. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. I always like panel discussions where there is a conflict between the participants. And I think that the conflict here, or the difference in defining the situation, is heard quite in an interesting way. Not the language, but the personality. Not the civic society, or not only the civic society, but a leader. Now the question is, what is your assessment and what is your recipe? One more interesting reflection about participating in a drama or a revolution of change, even though it might be a change over one's dead body. I mean, against your own interests. I think this is something completely different than what happened in the past. This is something much less dramatic, much less bloody and destructive. But there is a certain parallel of the need of power. And the need of power, as I understand, articulated by the people, the working class, although the middle class as well, against the elites. Now, I would like to open the floor. Who would like to comment or ask a question? Please be succinct in your statements. Okay. At the end of the room, there is another person. The Batory Foundation. I have a question to Mr. Gdula, because when you mentioned the reasons for peace's victory and why now we've got neo-authoritarian regime, you mentioned that people who felt excluded needed to feel more confident. You were talking about dignity, but when you discussed remedies to what is happening today, you said about you talked about things that were quite distant from personal experiences of an average man or woman. You were talking about reproductory rights or refugees or the EU. I'm wondering in what way those topics might form part of experience of an average man or woman, and the dignity that was reinstated by peace and that won them so much support. Thank you.
Я хотел бы спросить.
Moscow Carnegie Fund. What should the EU do, in your opinion, in terms of the situation in Hungary and Poland? These situations, of course, in many aspects, depend on the fact that the countries such as Poland and Hungary are member states of the European Union. Therefore, should there be more interventions? Because it might give rise to anti-European moods. I saw somebody in the back as well who wanted to speak. I see 3 hands at the back. I don't see the people, so okay, yeah, you and 2 more people. Good morning, good evening. I have a question to Maciej Gdula. Could you tell me in 2 words why you call this neo-authoritarianism, and what happens to a neo-authoritarian regime when the leader of the community, national community, does not have any official state function, but rules with two other people holding those official positions. A question to Mr. Magyar, or a short comment as well. I said it during the club's discussion in the morning. I said that describing Jarosław Kaczyński as an ideologist or fanatic is highly inappropriate, because if you're talking about Islam, Muslim fanatics who blow themselves up, and then you use the same words to describe Jarosław Kaczyński, I think it's definitely at least exaggerated. Now, another thing about the EU as the Union of Nations. I am highly critical about our current European policy that does not exist in any orderly or structured way. But I think this is a good diagnosis of the current state of the deconcentration of the European Union and the point that the EU is at the moment. If we continue the linear integration path, ever closer union, this will be, as the great German constitutional expert said, we would be as bike riders who need to pedal their bike all the time, because otherwise they will fall over. But a bike rider who can't stop at the traffic light or doesn't know which way they are going should not be on the bike at all. So thinking whether the idea of the Union of Nations is a good idea, I mean, I don't really know why you are drawing the conclusion from this that Poland or Hungary just want benefits but do not want any supervision on the part of the EU. Well, legally speaking, this is quite dubious, because the whole dialogue with the European Commission does not have any legal basis. But the idea itself, well, I don't really understand where your criticism comes from. Thank you very much. I think there are two more people who want to speak. Could you please raise your hands, everyone who'd like to speak? 2 hands? Okay, so those 2 questions or comments, and then let's go back to the panelists. Okay? Jana Mocha, a very short question to our guests. I'd like to ask you what kind of exit you see from those regimes. It's a short question that contains a lot of content. Are there any positive examples? Could you point out any examples of countries that were on a similar path and they were able to tackle such a political system? And if not, at least what are the conditions that would support an exit?
All right, 2 more, but please. Sara Pietruszek, University of Warsaw. I'll ask in Russian. I'd like to ask about the anniversary of the October Revolution. So let me ask a revolutionary question. Do you believe there's any chance for Russian democracy in relation to Ksenia Sobchak announcing that she would stand for president? To start with, I should like to ask everyone not to overuse the word regime, because we would lose sight of the situation if Russia is in a regime, and if we compare this to Central Asian or Latin American situation, it would be like government governing the country from a helicopter. But the question is, what do we do in order to make sure that this authoritarian power can be changed under democratic rules established in Europe? I suppose you are also suggesting, while asking this question, that this is possible in the first place. So let me suggest a reverse order. Let's start with Poland through Hungary, and let's end with Russia. I'll answer you very briefly. The first question was about dignity, and I don't suppose it's just about dignity as well. It's about a sense of participation. It's about a sense of belonging. It's a sense of not being on the margin. It's a sense of being powerful. It's an empowerment vehicle. This is why authoritarianism is here, because it's not just that we want our representatives. It's not that we want to have someone who will speak on our behalf, but it's about us wanting to put someone else under our boot. The left wing doesn't seem to get it. The left wing is on the side of those disadvantaged, that they will never get it. Sometimes you want to criticize those who are below, who are dominated, when they participate in a political system. We don't a political process that we disagree with. How come it's an authoritarian regime if Kaczynski is in power, but it's the prime minister and the president who are different people? Szydło. I suppose it's to reduce the cost of failure. It's easier. You don't have to fully pay the cost. When we did research, PIS supporters never doubt the actions of Kaczynski. They never say Kaczynski sucks, but Duda will stop him. No. People who support PIS, especially in the middle class, that they are the worst kind, they support Kaczynski on every score except for the anti-abortion law. Well, why? Because he doesn't support the law as well, or either, actually. So let's not be over-optimistic. It's not that people are against something that Kaczynski is in favor of. If he's in favor of, people will be in favor. You may seem this to be an over-exaggeration, but I suppose if Kaczynski suggests election into the episcopate of Poland, people would support it. Finally, we will take the Catholic Church in control. They are elites as well. We can sort out these elites as well. So I suggest that right-wing media could be taken on board on that score. This could fly. How do you get out of the situation? The question posed by Mrs. Mucha is very interesting. It's a relevant question and touches upon very fundamental issues. Can you go back to the old utopia where everyone was supposed to be middle class, or should we find another solution, a new solution? I believe we should look for a new solution. I suppose we should first of all articulate that there are differences between classes. We don't want to be in the utopia of being individuals, classless individuals. I think talking about classes will be more positive and more conducive for liberal democracy than actually denying. It'll be healthier in our societies, in the sense that some of the tension will be relieved. When we look at the structure in society, who is the most radical? It's young men in the working class. Sorry, they are the most radical because they feel they should be middle class, but they can't. They are sort of manual workers. They don't have partners. They can't take a loan because they can't afford it, etc. If these people are not offered something else, liberal democracy will not stand. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I would like to say that most of post-communist autocracies had nothing to do with liberal democracies. Post-communist autocracies emerged after the collapse of communist regimes, not because they became disillusioned of liberal democracy, but because of new revival of patron-client relations, what in different historical forms they had. If we start from Central Asia, there even the old communist elite remained in power in a changed form. Practically, in a lot of cases, high-level KGB leaders or first-party secretaries are the new leaders of these countries as well. In Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and all these things, we could see a phase of what I call oligarchic anarchy, where there was a weakening of the state, and at the same time there was a huge fight for not only for power but for property as well. When they privatized the economy, which meant that economy which was originally 100%, in quotation mark I say, 100% state-owned economy, of course, you could not create a fair privatization. There was no payable demand for that. Who should pay for that if you privatize an economy where there is no private economy there? One possibility which had a huge share, for example, in Hungary, that foreign capital is coming in and then actual capital is coming in. The other possibility that there is a connection who has better position in power, then they distribute the property there. But what is the result of this? The result of this is that you can build political programs for a just full redistribution of property all the time. And therefore, in most of these countries, now I'm not speaking about Poland, I'm speaking about Hungary and about, let us say, Romania, Bulgaria, and Russia and others, most of these elections are going about the redistribution, not only power, but the property as well. This is what happens. The problem here with in Poland, in the new authoritarian regimes, it's really correctly said that it has much more to do with the contradictions of liberal democracies, and this populism has more similarity with the Western populist tendencies than in the Eastern Bloc. What the EU can do? I think the first thing that the EU practically does not understand these regimes, and therefore they have very ineffective countermeasures against this. But there is a deep contradiction of some requirements which cannot be fulfilled at the same time. The EU had the idea to have the countries which share the values of liberal democracies on one hand, and on the other hand, it's in conflict with the geopolitical interests. Normally, it is said that Hungary is not pushed out of the EU because they do not have mechanism how to do it, etc., etc. But it's not the case. If there would be a very easy mechanism, they even should not do that. Because if they should push out all the countries who do not fulfill the requirements of liberal democracy, which was already originally around 2004 the target of entrance exam, then they should push a lot of country out of the EU, and the Russians would come until Vienna. It's the geopolitical interest. So therefore, about 4 years ago, with a friend of mine, we wrote an article that the multi-speed Europe is unavoidable. It's not the question of decision. It's unavoidable. And what will happen? That there will be a nucleus of the Europe, where there will be a stronger integration and cooperation. And on the other hand, there will be a buffer zone on the eastern part of Europe, where autocratic, half-autocratic regimes will be tolerated by the Europe because of geopolitical reasons. And especially if we are thinking of the enlargement of the EU, and they are thinking starting negotiations with Ukraine, Moldova, Serbia, Macedonia, nobody could think seriously that these countries will meet the democracy requirements, what even were met by those countries with the huge enlargement in 2004. It will never happen. But the EU will need it because of geopolitical reasons. Therefore, of course, there will be a border who are within the EU, who are outside of the EU, but after 2020, I think that it will be a much more pure bargain with those countries who will be in the buffer zone, and not the question of solidarity and how to bring up these countries. How much we have to pay you not to be totally disloyal with the EU? And this will be the bargain. And this is what Orban is doing in Hungary very well. Kaczynski cannot do this, you know. He is in a trap. He cannot be Russophile, of course. He cannot follow that. But this is why, for example, the EU, of course, at the same time is a very difficult situation because, well, in the case of Kaczynski and Kaczynski regime as a classic, going towards a classic autocracy or classic authoritarian regime, they understand the situation and they say you should not abolish the independence of the judiciary system, etc., etc. But in the case of Orban, and this regime, Orban regime, well, when he's a criminal organization, centrally led criminal organization, they are sitting with a criminal. Diplomatically, it's very difficult to solve this problem, you know. And of course, they sometimes attack Orban, but the Fidesz is still the member of the European People's Party, and therefore the so-called what I call dirty solidarity works. That they hold back their criticism towards Orban government. While in the case of PiS, PiS is not a member of the European People's Party. They can be more offensive when they have to react for the anti-democratic features of the regime. And whether, the next question was the last one, that whether is there exit from these regimes? I think that Poland is a much better situation than in Hungary. You have a proportionate election system. Proportionate election system. Well, if you measure with 44%, let us say 40% the PiS, with 44% Orban had an absolute monopoly of political power, two-thirds majority in the parliament. With 44%, the PiS won't have this majority. The second thing is that you have a credible, even if to some extent diminishing, but credible moderate right-wing party and liberal party, Civic Platform and Nowoczesna. We do not have liberal party, we do not have moderate right-wing party. We have only left-wing parties, fragmented left-wing parties. And when these fragmented left-wing parties try to criticize the Orban government and try to replace the Orban government, then they practically divide a complete identity change from the voters, from a conservative right-wing voters. Okay, now you should be a left-wing person, but they won't be a left-wing person, even if they want to get rid of Orban, if there is no other choice for that. Here, the local governments, a large share of the local governments, are ruled by the opposition parties, not in Hungary. Here, the private media is still free and not bought up by the oligarchs of Kaczynski. Kaczynski has no oligarchs in this sense. You know. So they are not bought up. So therefore, the situation in Poland is better. Of course, I agree that they need charismatic personalities. Without charismatic personalities, you cannot solve this problem. We have different views about the language, but it would need a longer time to speak about that. But in the case of Hungary, I think they are around a point of no return. This is in Russia. Nobody thinks seriously, where the chief attorney's office can detain anybody who has any chance to have even not to win the elections, but at least to have a better result, like or even murder him, like it happened in Russia as well. You know, it's not the case still in Hungary. But of course, the chief attorney's office in Hungary is the part of the election campaign staff of the Fidesz, and they are operating such a way. So it's so there are not even free and not even fair elections in Hungary, so therefore it's very difficult how to overcome that regime. I do not have an idea about it, but about Poland I think I'm much more optimistic.
Thank you. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the last question. As far as the regime is concerned, I'd like to start by saying that I did not use the word regime in a negative sense. It's a configuration of public institutions on all the lack thereof, in contrast with the situation in Hungary and Poland. And I sort of disagreed with Mr. Magyar because when you talk about mafia state, it's either state or mafia. In Russia, people, it's a regime, but people are not thrown, the planes are not shot into the sea if people on board are inconvenient, but we do have accidents, we do have murders committed by unknown perpetrators. Strange situations happen, and this is certainly supported by television campaigns in federal news networks. Having said that, it's a growing repressive character of the regime. We might have announced that revolution would be on the 5th of November. Moscow and the center of Moscow was a besieged stronghold, and 300 people were caught, totally random people, and it was totally inadequate response. And this is related to the election, the growing fear. And I spoke about this article in The Economist, and I also talked about what happened 100 years ago. The longer you are in power, the more you are detached from reality, and you tend to think that whatever you don't like are flashes and manifestations of secret services of foreign powers. Therefore, you react excessively, you overreact. This is the life in Russia. Now, over to the question posed by Mrs. Muha. How do we get out of this situation? How do we save ourselves from that? I suppose there are three themes here. Authoritarian regimes that rely on the unity of power and property are very difficult to abolish. Even if Putin leaves, fortunately, unfortunately, he's a human being. No one is eternal, or he's pushed out of the office, or basically dies. All the assets will be in the hands of oligarchs or regime operatives. How do you move to democracy from this? It's not clear. There are no ready-made answers. It's an open question. I suppose the experience of Latin America regimes, and there are topological parallels, Nicaragua or Dominicana, very small countries. I used to assess them in Wiadomości. In 2008, I published an article and I said that Russian liberals wanted Pinochet and they got Trujillo. The point is that instead of a regime that is modernizing the country, they have a regime that manages the country as if they managed their own household or farm. Such regimes have rather dire ends, even if they come back on a democratic path. They go through all sorts of processes because all the relations between the citizens and the government are skewed, and it's very hard. But there's a positive example, Brazil, and I tend to highlight this topic whenever I answer a question about the future of Russia. I always claim that the only successful strategy for Russia would be one that combines political and democratic protest and welfare demands of the low-income strata of the society, and the change in 2011 was purely political, and the protests were presented in public media as protests of middle class rather than protests, political protest, to use the language of Yulia Watinina. So protest is, by the way, the only problem of Russian opposition, because all the successful cases of transformation, for example, successful transformation in Brazil, indicates that it's the social demands that matter most, not political. Without social demand, social protests, there will always be a counter-argument. Here we go. These liberals who are wearing nice fur coats want more for themselves. As far as the last point is concerned, I disagree with my Polish colleague. I am not an authority on Polish or Hungarian issues. Even though I don't read in Polish, I take a lot of interest in that. I suppose that civil society self-organization or self-organization of civil society is the solution, and we've seen it already. It's emerging, and when civil society organizes itself, this will spill over on the political spheres. So I said, someone say it in St. Petersburg, we don't need people, we need structures. And relative to the demonstration of the 26th of March, it was Navalny who had convened this protest. And there were attempts at shouting, people shouted Navalny for president. But this was downplayed because people thought that it's not about people, it's about structures. I think you understand it in Poland. This morning, we spoke about the history of Russia as a sequence of frosty days and hot days, where the ice would melt. So the government takes control, then it collapses, the whole thing collapses, and the society is afraid of itself, and then gives the power to very very specific hands of an individual. And we cannot leave the circle through violence. I suppose we need to exercise patience in Russia. Always there is a lack of time, however. Whenever I say that we need to do our work building up civil society, everyone tells me we have no time. It's been 25 years and everyone says we don't have time as far as Ksenia Sobchak is concerned, who's running for president. I suppose this was masterminded by the Kremlin, and I suppose it's a very nice idea.
Nie mogę się zgodzić.
Well, there don't seem to be simple answers. I don't agree with the comment about what the EU should do, because I believe that EU is doomed for geopolitics, and you can't do anything with these countries. I don't suppose this is sufficient, but we need to leave it open right now. The suggestion that Russia needs patience is in clash with the assessment that Poland doesn't need patience, because while Russia is beyond the point of no return, so has Hungary. Poland has not yet hit the point of no return, and it's probably easier to return if you don't hit the point of no return. There is common denominator, but there are no shared recipes. There is a charismatic leader in Russia, in Hungary, and in Poland. There is no charismatic leader. Everyone is looking for him or her. We'll see whether the leader will emerge. So these are the both questions and observations, inconclusive as they are, perhaps. They certainly were really valuable, and thank you very much to everyone, and thank you very much to our speakers. And thank you very much for this fruitful debate and interesting questions and excellent discussion. Thank you.